Welcome to the first CSWR event of the fall semester, and very glad to see all of you here today. As you know, one of our ideals of the center is to make good use of this room and provide many memories, many thoughts during the year of events here, conversations of all kinds, and there'll be many programs to come in the weeks to come. So we're very glad to be able to invite you and welcome you here today. For those of you who are new and have not been here before, I'd just like to briefly point out that, first of all, my name is Frank Clooney. I'm a professor here in the Div School, and I'm the director of the center, so that's why I'm standing here talking. The second thing would be to say that the center, including this building in which we are currently gathered, was founded in 1960 and was founded precisely so that there could be a broader, more comprehensive study of religions in the plural at Harvard University, welcoming into the community people of different religious backgrounds and traditions to live together, to study together. There are residential space here. Some people live at the center. And to try to keep up on both the classical traditions, philosophical, theological materials, but also engage issues that matter today in our culture and world. And I think our panel today will be part of that. The mission statement of the center is very brief, and therefore I think I have an excuse to read it to you. To advance interdisciplinary, international, and interreligious exchange, learning, and research on the world's religions. To bring together the rich intellectual resources of faculty and students at Harvard Divinity School and other schools and departments of Harvard with an international scholarly network to explore issues of religion in today's complex, global, and changing world. To build a deeper and broader understanding of the histories and contemporary patterns of the world's religious communities by hosting scholars and practitioners at the center from all over the world. There are many themes that come up in our work. I've already mentioned some are very contemporary issues in the news. Some are classical traditions, specific to different traditions. It could be Christianity or Buddhism or Islam, whatever. Thematic issues such as the future of theology, the nature of translation of religious texts, social justice concerns and religions, a wide variety of topics. And again, I hope that many of these will appear in this room this year. And I think, therefore, I would stress that you who have gathered here today are part of this. You are part of the center. You're not simply visitors who come in and then, exit, but rather that your resources, your background, and some of you are new students here, some of you are visiting scholars, and I think the conversations we have benefit greatly from people's different perspectives. So I thank you for coming on that basis. And I would therefore ask you, where's Emily? There's Emily in the back. Emily is updating our email list. She has her nifty iPad there to do this. And therefore, if you're not on our list and would like to receive our announcements of events, please talk to Emily before you leave today. There is such a thing today, they say, as Facebook. I've never experienced it, but I hear exists. If you would befriend us on Facebook, that would be a very nice thing as well. So tell me what happens if you do that. And the last thing is that, in terms of, before introducing our panel, is that today's conversation, Body and Soul in the Study of Religions, will be followed by a lunch specifically for MTS and MDiv students tomorrow in the conference room in the front at noon. And the idea is to engage during the year doctoral students in one setting, faculty in another, staff in another, and to have special lunchtime conversations for MTS, MDiv students. The first one, since there always has to be a first one scheduled as we can, is tomorrow at noon to further discuss the theme of today's presentations, and also that those who come tomorrow will be invited to help steer the further conversations for the rest of the year. So if you are an MTS or MDiv student, you're most welcome to come back at noontime tomorrow. This topic, the body and soul in the study of religions, is, I think, basically a theme that challenges us both by its obvious and immediate relevance. We know that terms like soul and body have a long place in religious traditions. We know that people have often spoken almost as if these are empirical realities, body and soul. And we know that generations of scholars and religious practitioners East and West have also pulled these terms apart and said, isn't this creating a false dichotomy? Isn't it problematic to talk about the two as if you could have a soul and a body occasionally related to one another? But I think I was inspired to some extent to think of this topic a couple of years back when Francois Bavon, one of our senior professors, gave the Ingersoll lecture on the immortality of the soul. And he kind of made a pitch for the idea that we need, obviously, in today's world to think of the bodily realities in which we dwell, which connect us to one another, which can be shaped and taken apart in all kinds of different ways, and yet somehow to keep in the conversation something of that tradition of the soul, the spirit, and how to negotiate the space between the two. These are large topics, certainly can be taken apart from many different angles, but today we have, we're very lucky to have 4 of our colleagues who are willing to take up the topic, and I asked none of them to give the answer away, to explain body and soul completely, but rather to open up a conversation. I think when Mayra or Ahmed are speaking, at some point they may mention there's a series for the year that is very relevant to this, that this is in a sense an opening event for that series as well. So our speakers will speak in the order in which we find them. I think it might be most economic if I simply introduce all 4 right now, and then we can let them take their turns. So Mayra Rivera Rivera is our first speaker today. She joined the HDS faculty in July 2010 as an assistant professor of theology and Latina studies. She was previously assistant professor of theology at the Pacific School of Theology in Berkeley, California. She has mentored doctoral students in the Graduate Theological Union. Her transdisciplinary work in critical theological studies engages themes such as Christian theological themes in relation to current theory and philosophy, especially in feminist, post-colonial, and Latina studies. Her book, our 2007 book, A Touch of Transcendence, A Post-Colonial Theology of God, explored the relationship between models of divine otherness and ideas about interhuman difference. She's written and co-edited several books. She's currently finishing a book that explores the connections between theological and philosophical metaphors of body and flesh. Our second speaker, Ahmed Ragab, is also one of our newer and younger faculty. Joined the faculty in July 2011 as the Richard T. Watson Assistant Professor of Science and Religion at Harvard Divinity School. Ahmed was previously a visiting lecturer in the Divinity School for the 2009 fall semester, and since 2008 had been a doctoral fellow and lecturer in the Department of History of Science here at Harvard. He is a physician, a historian, a scholar of medieval and modern Middle East with a medical degree from Cairo University and a doctorate in the history of science from the École Pratique de Haute Étude in Paris. He's also a researcher at the National Center for Scientific Research in Cairo, where he directed the organization's Science and Religion and the History of Science programs. His interests, which are also multiple and manifold, include the history and development of medieval Islamic sciences, the relationship between science and religion in the medieval and modern Middle East, the history of medieval Islamic hospitals, and the intellectual and cultural history of women in the Middle Eastern region. He is author of numerous articles and papers and is completing 2 book projects, Science and Religion in Medieval Egypt and Anatomy, Medicine, and Religion in the Ottoman Middle East. And these will all be out any day now. Our third speaker has been here since 2005. Michael Jackson is an anthropologist with ethnographic experience in Sierra Leone and Aboriginal Australia. His work has been strongly influenced by critical theory, American pragmatism, and existential phenomenological thought. Through a direct engagement with the everyday situations and struggles that characterize human life in any society, irrespective of its specific historical and cultural conditions, the ethnographic method of participant observation promises not only an extended and deeper understanding of ourselves in relation to others and otherness, it may also provide new insights into the limits and possibilities of comparative analysis and viable coexistence in a multiplex world. He is an author of numerous books, too many to count, including the prize-winning Paths Toward a Clearing, At Home in the World. He has published 3 novels, a memoir, and 7 volumes of poetry. His most recent books are The Palm at the End of the Mind, Relatedness, Religiosity, and the Real in 2010, Life Within Limits, Well-Being in a World of Want, 2011, and Being of Two Minds, 2011. That was a good year for Michael. 2 other books are also in press at the moment. And finally, we have the most promising newest scholar on the panel. Mayra Rivera is a current PhD candidate in the study of religion. She's helping to coordinate the project that I alluded to earlier on science, religion, and culture at Harvard Divinity School. She is working in theology, Christian sexual ethics, and the study of religion and the history of science. Her dissertation project is on the constructions of madness and sexuality in mid-20th century American pastoral counseling literature. So you can see just from these introductions, it's a wonderful panel, and I'm very grateful to all 4 of our speakers for taking the time to do this today. So let us welcome our panel.
Thank you, Frank. Initially, when I heard the title for this panel, I was not surprised. As Frank said, we're used to talking about this pair, body and soul, as one unit. And in fact, the first thing that came to my mind was a jazz standard in the voice of Billie Holiday, Body and Soul. What did surprise me was that when I turned to think about theology and specifically about recent works in contemporary theology, nothing came to mind. Body and soul seemed to be absent. And this is significant. In the past 3 decades in theological studies, we have produced an enormous, perhaps even monstrous, body of literature examining precisely the Christian body. And that has transformed the field significantly. We have a better understanding of the diversity and the complexity of understandings of the relationship between body and spirit, or body and divinity, in Christian thought. And yet the problems and the debates have not subsided. And I think actually that the debates have been displaced from questions about the relationship between the body and divinity to questions about the nature of the body in its relationship to the world. So I want to share with you just simply a few ideas about what I think are the challenges that we are facing in what might be a new phase in theological studies about the body. And the first challenge is broad cultural changes in the imaginaries about bodies. And I'm thinking really about affluent countries. We have to keep the economic distinctions in mind here. But early debates in theological studies and in other fields relied on the categories of nature and culture. And then one would debate whether the body or some certain traits of the body would fall on the nature part or on the culture part. And if one added the theological question, then the questions would become, does the nature reflect the divine order, or is nature already part of a fallen order? And this structure, this conceptual structure of nature and culture has not disappeared. In fact, it's very alive in some debates in human rights movements in relation to genetics, etc. But a more complex view of that relationship is also emerging. If one thinks about the body as a whole, as a unity, we see a more emphasis in how practices transform bodies. And not simply the brain, but bodily processes of all kinds, rather than just thinking about how nature might be predetermining some corporeal traits. Technologies about, for instance, organ transplants have us all thinking about what is the significance of the fact that a part of one human body can become part of another human body. And not only that, also the fact that the non-human participates in these medical processes, from animals to bacteria to the inorganic. So we see a broader challenge to the boundaries of the human and the non-human. And even if we think about at the micro level, we see in fields like epigenetics attempts to understand how the environment affects the expression of genes. And think about what that means. It means that policies, public policies, that change the way and the practices of society eventually change the environment and affect what human bodies can or cannot become. So we're not saying simply that bodies are located in societies. We used to talk about social location. We're seeing something deeper than that. We're thinking about how bodies are constituted in these relationships. So scholars in different fields are beginning to think about the implications of these cultural changes for areas such as law, human rights, bioethics, etc. And I want to propose that this is one of the challenges for theological studies. And in theological studies, we'll see some of the tasks will be similar to those facing lawyers and people doing public health. We have to think, what do we mean by nature? What do we mean by human bodies? How do we regulate how we go about changing the nature of bodies? But there are also challenges that are intrinsic to theological studies. They highlight, for instance, how there is a tendency in modern accounts of body and soul to focus on an individual unit, in contrast to this deep and ambiguous relationality that we see emerging. So for the particular purposes of this panel, we were asked to address body and soul in the study of religions in the plural. And here comes then my second challenge. In theological studies, very often, the appeals to the significance of the body or the theological significance of the body is framed or justified with allusions to the incarnation. And this is not an incarnation simply conceived as the becoming of the deity becoming a body. Something much more complex is at stake, even though if you read the literature of many theorists write on the subject, you would have the impression that that is what it means. But think, for instance, some Christian and secular thinkers offer the following interpretation of the incarnation. Because God became human, emptied God's self in the world, so the argument goes, now the religious or our religious responsibility or our ethical responsibility becomes toward the world. Now, is that still a Christian story, even if it's so expansive? And shall we be asking a question that Maurice Merleau-Ponty asked in the midst of writing his own work about the body? And I'll quote him. How can we take ideas like the incarnation away from Christianity in order to attribute them to a universal reason with no birthplace? So is this kind of theological argument necessary or even helpful in the context of religions in the plural? Or shall we seek another different starting point? And this then leads me to my final point. While researching the book I am currently writing, I've been reading a lot of descriptions of the Christian body, particularly philosophical ones. And they tend to focus on metaphysical questions, questions such as the relationship between immateriality, materiality and divinity, between rationality and the senses, etc. And you can see from my previous remarks that I think that those questions are extremely important. And yet, something crucial is lost when we bracket the poetic dimensions of religious accounts of things like the incarnation or corporeal experiences. So these accounts might reflect worldviews, but they cannot always be reduced to them. I have been inspired by the work of a Martinican philosopher, Edouard Glissant, by the title Poetics of Relation, to try to think, how can we find an approach that supplements rigorous philosophical analysis with that attentiveness to poetic structures, to poetic dimensions of thought? And I wonder if that attention to that poetic dimension and even to the imaginary offers us a better place to start to think about body and soul in the multiplicity of religions. And I don't think it is accidental that so many of us in the faculty at HDS are interested in related topics: poetry, theopoetics, theodrama, etc. And perhaps I should not be surprised if body and soul first led me to think of a song. Thank you.
Well, that's hard to follow. So let me first start with the announcement that Frank promised. We have a series this year that's a sort of a celebration, the Year of the Body, and you can find here a list of the talks that we have in a handout that you can find on the table. You can pick up one when you're going out. So when I was studying, when I started thinking or studying history of medicine in the medieval world, one of the very first things that, or the very first questions that a lot of people think about is the question of anatomy. Why people didn't simply do dissection, what happened, and why didn't they open bodies? It's something that a lot of people, a lot of historians of medicine think about almost all the time. And when we read treatises about anatomy, there's a very interesting account about the soul, that you can actually find it when you open a body. And that's a very interesting, that was always a very intriguing thing to me. When you open the heart, they say, when you open the heart of an animal that just died, you'll notice something that's very interesting. There's a big blood clot on the right side, and there's vapor coming out of the left side. That's the soul. The understanding of the soul in its very material sense, in a sense that is actually, that makes it something that is almost visible, though we cannot see it all the time, and though if you're very late or a little late after the death of the animal, you'll probably won't be able to see it, is something that's extremely interesting. It's interesting because it troubles this "and" that we have in the title of the panel. The body and the soul cannot become a sort of a dichotomy of materiality and immateriality because the soul in itself existed in a material form for a very long time. The notion even of the finiteness of the body and the infinity of the soul can also be troubled because the soul is so small and finite, it fits in one side of the heart. And it actually can be touched and can be seen, and even some argued can be smelled. It appears to be something that's very material at its essence. But the question of the body and the soul can also be understood or can be thought about in a completely different way, a way that's related to ethics of knowledge. Or when we think about the body and the soul as two important symbols of two different ways or two conjunctional ways of knowing. The body and the soul represent agents of knowing. They also can represent objects of knowledge, and they can stand for some kind of ethics or virtues of knowledge. As agents of knowledge, we see throughout history a discussion of what you can learn through your soul, your heart, your intellect, different words that refer to some form of immateriality, and what you can learn through your body. And the difference between the two is not really a difference of discipline or of the ability to learn, but it is rather an important distinction of the different types or the hierarchy of knowledge. What we used to learn throughout history, what we used to learn through our intellect and through our hearts and through our souls, always occupied a position that's much higher than what we used to learn through our bodies. Epistemes, ideas and thoughts, philosophy and theology were always at the top of the hierarchy of knowledge, while, for instance, the other crafts that you learn, the techniques, always occupied the bottom. These are things that you can learn through your body. However, and this also applies not only to scientific or practical or philosophical knowledge, but also to religious knowledge. You can learn your religion, learn about God through your soul. However, your knowledge of the soul can only and is always reflected through bodily influences. It can only be reflected through the body. Think, for instance, about a type of religious learning or religious knowledge that existed in Judaism and Islam, and think about circumcision as an important bodily influence or bodily effect that represents this particular type of knowledge. When we look at Muhammad's story as a very important framing history in the Islamic mind or in the consciousness of Islamic religiosity, Muhammad goes through two processes of bodily transformation. The first is circumcision, and we are told that he was born circumcised. Circumcision becomes an act of bodily purification that should reflect soul or spiritual purification. Any person who converts should perform circumcision, and they also should take a bath. And the importance of this kind of physical transformation reflects what should be a spiritual transformation. However, when he was a child, Muhammad would undergo another act of physical purification, where his heart is opened by the archangel, where his chest is open, his heart taken out, and a piece that is called the lot of Satan is cut off his heart. Scholars always wondered why this very direct physical modification in terms of circumcision happened before birth, while what is supposed to be the spiritual side of it happening inside the heart happened after birth. No one really reached an answer on that one. However, the thing is, the point that I want to describe here is how this kind of spiritual or soul-related type of knowledge always influenced the body and always reflected itself in a form of an intersubjectivity that could not be perceived without corporeal representation. Circumcision is not only an act of purifying the body, it's also an act of bodily distinction that creates a difference between different bodies, and therefore that creates categories that did not exist before, and that inflects a bodily and corporeal representation on what is perceived to be a spiritual existence beforehand. Body and soul are also discussions of, or can be thought of as objects of knowledge. For instance, the notion of how we learn, or should we actually study things that are immaterial or study things that are material. The study of the immaterial in many ways is considered to be, or was in times in our history, was considered to be spiritual, and in many cases today is considered by a lot of scientists as trivial. On the other hand, the bodily knowledge, the knowledge of the body, can be considered more influential. It has more effects, it has more direct influences. But in either case, knowledge requires a certain fashioning of the object of knowledge. We don't know things as they are. We need to categorize, systematize, and understand them in a specific way. Bodily knowledge, or the knowledge of the body as an object of knowledge, had to be defined, categorized, and arranged in a particular manner. In a manner that allowed for the appearance of normality and abnormality, for instance, and that also allows for appearance of what we can see as disease or health, for instance, as life and death. And in many cases, these types of arrangements that limit and that categorize or arrange the body in order for it to be reborn as an object of our knowledge involves as well a rearrangement of the soul, a rearrangement of what we perceive as some form of immateriality that we need to understand. The body and the soul as objects of knowledge reflect other important epistemic biases, if you will, or ethics of knowledge in general. They reflect conceptions about masculinity and femininity. And they reflect also questions about race, for instance. They have been always part of the colonial discourse in missionary medicine, for instance. The questions of how you can address the non-white people through their spirits and through appealing to their spiritual knowledge, while on the other hand, you're only trying to actually control their bodies. It actually survives in a lot of discourses of global medicine. When you see, for instance, a description of particular cultures that lack hygiene, meaning that it is not the infrastructure, it is not the water, it's none of that. It's something else, something that's probably immaterial, that's probably related to the souls or minds or cultures of these people, when the term culture is used so vaguely in order to represent so many things that we cannot say, or probably we do not want to say. What I'm trying to explore here, or what I was trying to trouble in many ways, is the word "and" that existed in the title. And in doing this, I was trying to think about the body and the soul as systems of knowing, as systems that allow us to know as agents of knowledge and to become in ourselves objects of knowledge, and that also govern the kind of ethics that we have, or what we can call epistemic ethics. Thank you.
Well, in some ways, my remarks are a postscript or a footnote to that very eloquent presentation of Ahmed's. Based on my research in the contemporary world in Aboriginal Australia. Now, I'm not the first anthropologist to experience difficulties with the word religion. For while its currency seems fairly unproblematic in contemporary Euro-American discourse, no equivalent term exists in the kinds of stateless societies that anthropologists have traditionally made their fields of study and in which I have worked. Not only is there an absence in these societies of a clearly demarcated field of belief, experience, and action that might be covered by such terms as the religious, the supernatural, the sacred, or the occult, many of the indigenous terms that we freely translate as spirit, soul, or sacred have very different connotations than these terms have for us. Generally speaking, the embodied and the ethereal are not construed as different essences. So the question as to how a body is related to soul does not arise as it does in Cartesian thought. And I want to talk a little about the Warlpiri people in Central Australia in the Tanami Desert, among whom my wife and I worked throughout the 1990s. Warlpiri thought is reminiscent in many ways of the Old Testament notion of the spirit as breath, or medieval notions of the humours, in which different emotions are associated with different physical organs. My Warlpiri informants were adamant, for example, that places that were called sacred sites in English could not be compared with our churches, but bore a closer resemblance to our war memorials, because these places were where one's forebears resided in a state of latency or potentiality, and from where they could re-enter the lives of the living through revelation in dreams, through conception, through being taken into the body of a woman and thus impregnating her, and through ceremony, which animated or reanimated these ancestral figures. In Warlpiri, such ancestral places are called mialu, which is a word that denotes the lower abdomen or a woman's womb, and connotes a physical site where life passes into and out of presently embodied being. I'm translating clumsily Warlpiri words, in this case a word pulka, which refers to anything which fills a space. A rock hole which has water in it, a stomach which is filled with food, lungs which were filled with breath, the world which is filled with people. But Warlpiri do not reify absence or presence as dead and alive, since these are transitory moments in an ongoing process of disappearance and reappearance. As for the Warlpiri word burlipa, that is often translated as spirit or soul, it too suggests a visceral rather than purely ethereal reality, and also refers to the lower abdomen, in particular the liver, the seat of the emotions and of the life force. What we might call spirituality is for Warlpiri an embodied reality, a matter of gut feeling rather than sublime sensibilities that transcend corporeality. What I'd like to do now is describe an episode from my fieldwork among the Warlpiri that will hopefully give you a sense of how difficult it is to deploy this contrast between body and soul in this cultural context. In the winter of 1990, my wife and I were living in the Warlpiri settlement of Lajamanu in the northern Tanami Desert of Central Australia. Our caravan was parked under a ghost gum behind the Woolane Outstation Resource Centre, a prefabricated aluminum-sided shed and centre of operations for the Central Land Council, under whose aegis Francine and I were doing our fieldwork. Woolane's veranda afforded shade, and I would sometimes sit there with older Warlpiri men clumped together on the concrete as if a single body. One afternoon, we were joined by Bani Japaljari, a thick-set, middle-aged man with a penchant for pama, which is literally sweet things, but nowadays includes alcohol, but whose grumpy and taciturn manner suggested complete indifference to our desultory talk of dreamings and related matters. Suddenly, Japaljari toppled over. I thought he might be drunk and had passed out, but the other men did not stop to think. Moving as one, they reached out to him, pressing the palms of their hands against his body and his head. A few minutes passed, and Japaljari revived. Not a word was said as he sat up, resuming his place among us. What prompted the men to act as they did? If a person loses consciousness, as Japaljari had, it meant that his life force, burlipa, had momentarily deserted him. To prevent this loss of life, this draining away of the burlipa, one placed one's hands on the body of the afflicted individual, holding him together, as it were, containing him. Is it helpful to see this as a religious moment, or even a medical intervention? How do Warlpiri see it? The short answer is they see it pragmatically. If a container of water is knocked over, one immediately moves to return the container to upright, thus preserving as much of the precious water as possible. No conceptually elaborated theory of why water is imperative for life is needed, either as a script for action or as a post facto rationalization of why one did what one did. In Aboriginal English, Warlpiri will simply say that water is dear, in the same way that they will refer to a significant other with the phrase "im dear one," meaning that one's own life and this person's life are mutually entailed, mutually necessary. Religion, as we use the word, usually implies some kind of belief, a worldview, a moral rationale or script that guides our actions. But where one acts to preserve life rather than risk its loss, as the Warlpiri men did when they laid their hands on Japaljerry, or when we return to an upright position a container that has fallen over, the rationale is akin to Spinoza's notion that we act to persist in life rather than lose it. When Warlpiri clear the ground in preparation for ritual work, or burn grassland in order to encourage new growth, their rationale is that they are doing what is necessary to sustain life. So my question is, do we need a radically different perspective when seeking to understand life worlds like the Warlpiri, or that they are essentially unlike us and deserving of the labels we use of them, primitive, pre-modern, tribal, traditional, indigenous? Or do societies like the Warlpiri offer us a perspective that we may deploy in deconstructing the ways in which we sometimes constitute the world in terms of such antinomies as religion and ritual, sacred and secular, spirit and matter, body and soul? Thank you.
When I first heard the topic of this panel, it struck me that it's much more common to hear contemporary scholarly talk about religion in the body than it is to hear talk about religion in the soul. Over the last 25 years or so, the body has emerged as a prominent focus of analysis across various disciplines. In my estimation, this cross-disciplinary interest in the body has had pronounced and beneficial effects on the study of religion, which are reflected not least in recent thought about practice, ritual, and liturgy, about power, writing, and experience. But it seemed to me that soul, on the other hand, doesn't fit quite as comfortably into the various questions and concerns that frame contemporary studies. Indeed, one wonders whether whoever chose this particular panel topic was looking for trouble. And yet the coupling of body and soul in our discussion today rings with a certain familiarity. It certainly doesn't appear to be a pair chosen at random. Quite the contrary. There are long histories of articulating relationships or connections here. And it's a couplet on which many would tread lightly, a couplet that provokes worry or anxiety, that body and soul inevitably bears the inheritance of particular philosophical and theological contexts. Indeed, it's quite common to critique and dismiss body-soul language for fear of what might be inextricably encoded in the pair. That is, assumptions that human life can be split into several dualities, corporeal and incorporeal, material and immaterial, fleeting and lasting, and so on. On the other hand, even a cursory scan across various cultural contexts, traditions, and issues in translation suggests a rather daunting array of the uses and meanings of soul and its related terms: spirit, mind, self, Atman, ego. So on one hand, one meets expectations of soul as a specific entity of sorts, distinct from the body, while on another hand, soul and its related terms exhibit a vast diversity of uses and meanings, both of which make this a difficult term indeed. Not that body is easy. In a 1990 review article on knowledge of the body and the study of religion, Larry Sullivan notes that while it's striking that the body appears as a primary instrument of knowledge across a wide range of historical and cultural examples, various understandings and conceptions of the body are markedly different. Along similar lines, there's been much work in recent years that promises to challenge and inform our thinking here. Authors like Michel Foucault, Pierre Bourdieu, Jean Comarath, and Catherine Bell invite us to think about ways in which specific social practices structure, form, and invest the body. Authors like Emily Martin and Thomas Lacour invite us to think about ways in which shifting medical, scientific, and political discourses impact cultural perceptions of bodies. Authors like Marcel Mauss and Judith Butler challenge conceptions of bodies as natural, stable, or as blank sheets of canvas awaiting the brushstrokes of their particularity. Mauss invites us to think of bodies as ensembles of acquired aptitudes, behaviors, and dispositions. Butler invites us to think of bodies in terms of processes of materialization, rather than as inert masses of matter. Authors like Nancy Shepherd-Hughes and Henri de Labac beg us to ask, which body? A lived body? A representational body? A body politic? The mystical body of Christ? Finally, authors across disciplines have drawn attention to the importance of race, class, ability, gender, and sex, all of which invite us to interrogate the impacts of bodily difference. Together, these different studies pose the question of how assuredly we can speak about the body as though it entailed something self-evident that we could simply assume or agree on without investigating its particular elaborations across different cultures and societies. These challenges and considerations have shaped thought about religion in really exciting ways. Indeed, there's much to be said about how these and other productive lines of analysis might continue to impact academic scholarship on religion and theology. But I think we also need to ask, are there aspects of religious expression, practice, or teaching that this recent interest in the body might unwittingly conceal? Here, I think the particular coupling of body and soul gets really interesting. In two very different veins, Jean Baudrillard and Mary Midgley have suggested that in the modern West, body has taken over certain functions of soul in social imaginaries. They both use the term successor when speaking about body in relation to soul. This is, of course, a very different opposition to the one that I alluded to above between body and soul as fundamentally different substances. I think this opposition that Baudrillard and Midgley highlight raises another wonder, or worry, about the widespread scholarly focus on body. And that is, to what extent might the emphasis on body obscure and in effect dismiss the soul language that religious discourses, texts, and practitioners might use? Though perhaps not without certain difficulties or discomforts, what kinds of challenges, connections, or observations that might otherwise go unnoted could work on soul, or soul and body cast in sharper relief? Though in my comments, I'll move away from the notions I alluded to of soul as something temporarily taking residence in a body. I want to be clear that I'm not suggesting that even the most extreme articulations of body and soul as separate substances should be dismissed out of hand. Indeed, it's not uncommon for people to talk this way. We might hear people speak about out-of-body experiences, or hear people living with aging, chronic illness, or disability say something like, "I'm trapped in my body," and so on. Of course, this is not to say that when encountered, these forms of speech should be uncritically appropriated, but neither should we as scholars immediately seek to, in Veena Das's idiom, break through the resistance of the other. To the contrary, we might remain open to thinking through ways in which use of this language helps people to order, understand, and come to terms with their life experiences. I'd like to frame my remaining remarks with something that I spend time thinking about, which I might broadly characterize with the following question. What would it look like if thought about science and religion moved away from conversations that imagine the two as separate entities whose potential compatibilities are the focus of investigation, towards conversations that better engage instability, flexibility, and exchange in discourse and practice? Conversations that illuminate the formative effects that these have on things like identities, subjectivities, and experiences. This is one question that frames my research on madness and sexuality in 20th century American pastoral counseling literature. A prominent concern in these texts is the question of whether and to what extent pastoral counseling is distinct from other ostensibly secular counseling, analysis, and psychotherapeutic practices. As the relations between these cultures of healing are worked and reworked, boundaries are drawn around different medical, scientific, and religious healing practices, but not boundaries that are static or impenetrable, rather boundaries that are porous, in flux, and shifting. Body and soul are crucial terms in various attempts to shore up distinctions and to configure collaborations. I'd like to talk briefly about uses of soul in one text, and I'll suggest that what's really important here is not what the articulation of soul is per se, although that's interesting, so much as how this articulation functions in one author's attempt to navigate a broader context of knowing, treating, and healing. Indeed, this particular text offers a case study of plurality internal to a specific context. Charles Holman was one of the first American pastors to hold the view that new developments in psychology and in psychiatry should have significant effects on conceptions and practices within pastoral counseling. His attempt to formulate a pastoral psychology was published in 1932 in a book titled The Cure of Souls. While the particular forms of medical, scientific, and philosophical inquiry that Holman engages may have been unique to his context, the notion of curing or caring for souls was not. This title is an English translation of the Latin cura animarum, a phrase used in medieval texts and manuals. One might expect Holman to presume acceptance of this traditional phrase, but to the contrary, his text opens as follows, quote, "It is useless to talk about the cure of souls if there are no souls to cure. This discussion assumes that there are souls and that they are sometimes sick, hurt, wounded," end quote. Of course there are souls, he writes later, but this is not something he anticipates his reader taking for granted. Why might Holman have felt obliged to acknowledge and to insist on the reality of soul? One reason might be that he wanted to curb suspicions that he relied on certain unsavory notions. Another might be that he is underscoring the stakes here, that something about soul is essential in the experience, representation, and treatment of suffering. Still another might be that Holman uses soul to navigate his broader context in a particular way. Let's look at his articulation of soul. He writes, quote, "The body is an actual constitutive factor in the total personality, and the personality is what we have in mind when we use the term soul. The soul is what we are. It is our very self," end quote. If you notice the use of personality, a term widely circulated in the psychological and social scientific discourses that Holman was reading, personality or soul is not something given, but rather something achieved in a process of social living. So we see here a notion of human nature as something dynamic and socially conditioned, something formed and reformable. You can hear this reflected in the language he uses to describe the soul. He says it's built, constructed, molded, shaped. Well, there's much to discuss here. Let me just underscore that while Holman anticipates his reader's trepidation with soul language, he insists on using it both to establish footing in a larger territory of healing discourses and practices, and to set this particular religious counseling practice apart. So perhaps all of this leaves us with more questions than answers. I suggested above the importance of remaining open to specific language use and function. But being open in this sense is not a mere matter of politeness. Scholarly inquiry is inevitably shaped by certain questions, categories, and assumptions, and as such, some lines of analysis will appear more pronounced than others. Of course, communities of scholars, texts, and practitioners alike are all involved in ongoing processes of fashioning constructs of lives, of concepts, practices, and beliefs. I think this is both an invitation to engage multiplicity and a warning against the dangers of not doing so. A character, Alicia, in James Baldwin's novel Go Tell It on the Mountain, better articulates this dual sense of anxiety and opportunity here when he says to another character, quote, "Boy, ain't it time you start thinking about your soul? I know it looks hard," end quote. I like that because I think it does look hard, but maybe with terms as challenging and as important as these, we'd do well to hold a watchful eye towards the possibilities and limitations of our pattern of thought. Thanks.